A very warm welcome to the teaching for the Parish Evangelisation cells. How did Jesus pray, and why was his prayer answered? These two questions are based on Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 5, verse 7. I quote, "In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard on account of, because of his reverent submission for God." I would like to make two reflections, two comments on this verse. First, this verse is one of the clearest historical references to Christ's life in the New Testament outside the Gospels. The author seems to completely dismiss the idea that Jesus is a mystical, non-historical figure by reminding us what happened in the days of his flesh. That is to say, in the course of his whole human life on earth, when he lived in bodily form and was subject to all the frailty and limitation characteristic of humanity. The second comment is, this verse illustrates Christ's total dependence on God in his earthly life that reached its climax in Gethsemane and on the cross. Now, this quote prompts me to ask the first question. How did Jesus pray? Jesus offered up prayers and supplication with loud cries and tears. Prayers and supplications are remarkable words, evoking the Son's way of praying to his Father. The former word, that is, prayer, is the general New Testament word for prayer, but the latter indicates a submissive request, a pleading, an entreaty, couched in prayer. The loud cries and tears suggests a reference, without being definitive, to Jesus' anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night before he died, as he faced the approaching crisis of his brutal death, which Luke vividly describes in his Gospel. And I quote, "He knelt down and prayed, 'Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done.'" In his anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. My dear friends, the terror of being forsaken by his Father in death must have especially pressed upon Jesus on that occasion. what sort of cry he made. It is a cry which someone does not choose to utter, but is squeezed from the individual in the throes of excruciating pain. There is no human anguish or suffering which Jesus has not experienced. He can therefore sympathize with us in every situation, because he himself has experienced every kind of affliction, suffering we endure. The second question: why did God answer Jesus' prayers and supplications? And the text has given us an answer. He was heard because of his reverent submission for God. The author confidently, firmly believes that Jesus' prayer and supplication in Gethsemane was heard because of his deep reverence for his Father. Yet, this part of the verse has been a bone of contention among biblical scholars. The phrase reverent submission translates the Greek word eulabeia, carefully used by the author to express fear, but in the sense of reverence, fear of God, reverence of God, godly fear, piety, reverential regard, respect, and not phobos, which is the more common word for fear. Indeed, in the whole of the New Testament, this word, eulabeia, is used only twice, and we find it precisely in the letter to the Hebrews. Now, we may ask the question, since Jesus in Gethsemane apparently, seemingly, prayed that he might be experienced from undergoing death, Father, he says, according to Luke, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. And his prayer was heard. Why did he die? Is there a contradiction between this text, Hebrews text, and Luke's? In what sense was Jesus' prayerfully submissive request answered or heard? That Jesus was heard does not mean that he was spared from his impending death. Jesus prayed not to be spared from death, but rather that God's will be done. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. It is this prayer that was heard. But being heard does not mean that the prayer was granted a favorable answer, reply immediately. While the outcome of Gethsemane, the Gethsemane experience, may suggest that God did not hear that prayer in the sense of delivering Jesus from crucifixion, God did actually hear it, endorsing his son's God-honoring life of obedience, namely Jesus' life of reverent submission to his Father, by rescuing him out of the realm or power of death. On account of the Son's attitude of complete abandonment, submission to the Father's will, in the course of his whole earthly life, the Father attended, listened to his Son's loud cries and tears that was accomplished through the resurrection. The words, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears, conjure up in our minds Jesus' agonizing prayer in Gethsemane. But the broad time reference in the days of his flesh suggests that Jesus' earthly prayers were constantly heartfelt, earnest, and tearful. The rabbis had a saying, there are three kinds of prayers, each loftier than the preceding: prayer, crying, and tears. Prayer is made in silence, crying with raised voice, but tears overcome all things. My dear friends, Jesus knew even the anguished prayer of tears. The Gospel accounts do not mention tears, but tears, I believe, would not be out of tune, out of keeping with these accounts. Now, some material for the group discussion. I'm sure we all have felt at some stage in our life that God did not hear or answer our prayers. God answers favorably, perhaps not immediately, to obedient children, namely children who lead a God-honoring life of obedience. A question: is my prayer, the way I pray, a reflection of an obedient life to God's will? Jesus, like us, though he was the Son of God, underwent temptation to swerve from doing God's will because of the suffering involved. Doing God's will entails suffering. Am I willing to do what God asked me to do despite the suffering I may have to endure? At times we will undergo trials, not because we want to suffer, but because we want to do God's will. My prayer for you and for me is, let Jesus' godly life of obedience sustain and encourage us in times of trial. God bless.